To start our event, Sarah Watson, Deputy Director at CHPC, who's been at CHPC for more than 10 years, but who is originally from London, where she worked on a regeneration project that we'll be talking about a lot today. Sarah.
Good morning. Morning. Am I good to go? I've been here 10 years. I'm originally from the UK, so my theys and we's may be a bit mixed up through this presentation, so forgive me. And also I'm a little winded with this baby, so I'm going to be slow. Okay, so I wanted to just give you big picture context for public housing in the UK and what really happened. I'm calling it the story of change. In your program, we have a little glossary for you, so we didn't really want our guests to have to translate into New York words things, so it's kind of on you to do that translation. So you have a little glossary in there. There's no exact translations, but because everything's different in different places, we acknowledge that. But take a look at the glossary, and through my little framing presentation, I'll sort of pull out some of those keywords that you'll hear from the panelists. One of them is regeneration. That's how it was couched in the UK, regenerating public housing, and that's really, we're talking about some bold physical improvements for public housing and improvements of the ongoing management, and that was achieved in many different ways. So regeneration was like a catch-all for making sure that it was about improving conditions now and ongoing. So basic context is the UK went crazy with public housing development. For many reasons, we had sort of invented public housing as the first examples in the UK because we hit the problem of industrialized slums way earlier than anyone else. We were also, as the inventors of capitalism, fearful about regulating the private sector, so decided that government was the one to do it. So with the first powers for local governments to clear slums, borrow from the national treasury, start doing some bond trading and build their own housing. And then we had, through the 20th century, many wars, we had rationing, we had bombing, we had many sort of situations that lent itself to the government being the one to be the sole responder of housing issues. So it was really our only tool that we used for any housing crisis that came along, and got us to this place where in the 80s, which was the peak, 1980 was the peak, in London we had 770,000 public housing units. So because of that history, we have very diverse stock. This was like the first public housing in the world, the Boundary Estate, which opened in 1900. And you can see that through the 20th century, we picked up on public housing taking many different architectural styles, but that's why in the 80s it was an even more intense situation that we had such a diversity of different stock. So we have stock in London that looks like this. We built like whole new little neighborhoods the government was responsible for. So we had houses, more low density stock that looked like this. And then through the 20th century got sort of more familiar forms than we're used to here, where we're going into replication of a architectural form, and then really pushed that even further. This is some in North London. And then we carried on longer than here in the 60s and 70s too, using new industrial methods of development. So this is some public housing in London and here. So a big difference you can see in your glossary, you'll hear being referred to as council housing or local authority housing rather than public housing. That's because London is broken up into 33 different councils, which is like a council district. Just to make it easy, we call it many different things. It could be called the borough, could be called the council, could be called the local authority. So you'll hear that maybe being talked about differently. And it was the housing authority was much more connected to the local government than it is here, which is good in terms of political buy-in. So what happens to public housing is the voters. So you're kind of voting much more connected to the housing authority than it is here. that can have other problems. But another advantage is actually that at least the 770 was divided into 33 different housing authorities that then could work out their own strategy forward. Overall, about a third of all households in London lived in public housing in 1980. Some of these boroughs, so you can see in the middle where the arrow's going, a council called Tower Hamlets, 86% of the households in the 1980s lived in public housing. So we really had an intensive situation. And hit a crisis in 1980 because the older stock that had been built in 1900 and had no really ongoing maintenance and repairs was hitting bad conditions, but also the 70s stuff that we had built 10 years earlier was also falling apart. So we had a public housing crisis that rings very similar to here. Declining conditions, the cost of operating was too high, the lack of subsidies, reduction in national subsidies to local governments, problematic management, disenfranchised tenants who didn't really have many options. And then it's sort of gone even more extensive than we have here, which is sort of the next step, which is that conditions are so bad they aren't actually habitable. And we had a real problem with abandoned homes and boarded up homes that couldn't be filled, even though we also had a housing crisis. There was bold leadership to make the change, the story of change. We're not replicating Margaret Thatcher, but I just wanted to say that bold leadership is needed for something so substantial as this. And we had maybe one of the boldest housing policy responses that has ever been seen, probably on a par of like the government starting to build in the first place. And that is the first phase, the right to buy, which Thatcher invented. In effect, all public housing tenants were given the right to buy their home. The response had been that we were in such a crisis point, something that big had to happen. This is Margaret Thatcher with a public housing family after they had bought their unit. So the major goals were a clarity around reduced operational burden on housing authorities. So it was really just get rid of the stock, and it's almost like the most socialist version of privatization that you can have. We're going to get rid of it, and we're going to give it to the people themselves. And the most burdensome stock had the biggest discounts, up to like 75%, 80% market discounts. Basically, if you could raise a mortgage, you could buy your unit. There was maybe 2 or 3 years where you had to stay in it, but very little restrictions after that. So it actually became its own sort of market, home ownership market. You still hear today people saying, how did you buy in London? And they say, well, it was ex-council. Like it's still a sort of a form of housing, almost like the first rung on the ladder you could get to before you move into a different sort of home. And then allowing tenants to become owners. So this was a pretty substantial response. So in London, about 290,000 homes were sold to tenants. You can obviously imagine that having a big impact actually on the city as a whole, and the social and economic fabric of the city really, really was affected by this. But you have some real downsides to a bold policy like this. And that is you're left with the worst quality housing and the poorest people with the least options. And that's where we were in the 90s. So this is phase 2, really, which is a lot of what we're going to talk about today, which is what do we do now? And the phase I'm calling, it was a menu of options for how to regenerate this remaining housing that was really the worst conditions. And so talking about regeneration as, we're talking about substantial rehab, or redevelopment, demolition redevelopment, plus improved management. And there was a real clarity around the goal for this phase, and there has been ever since. And it was around this very English terminology of decent home. We must live in a decent home. The decent home standard gave a clarity for every public housing unit had to hit this in 10 years. That was the goal. So we're all in it together. We have to get every public housing unit remaining to get up to this standard. And again, the most English phrased, everything was reasonable. But obviously this could be the housing maintenance code. in New York. Plus, the goal was elevating the role of tenants in the decision-making to get there was a big goal, because we were really left with tenants who had the least options in the worst quality housing. So this was the non-decent, is a nice terminology that we have in housing in the UK. About 43% of all public housing stock was classified as non-decent in 2000 still. So this, in effect, was the strategy to try and get to decent homes as the goal. We had this big, burdensome situation for housing authorities who were like adrift, had no operating subsidy, had this like terrible condition housing with the tenants with the least options, struggling. So the strategy really was, and we had the tenants struggling. We did have a very small affordable housing industry doing their own thing, not subsidized by government. Again, we've been reluctant in the UK to subsidize or regulate, like let private industry do its own thing. So this was a big change for the UK culturally. So there was a small amount. In London, there was about 30,000 homes before this change being done by charities, effectively non-profit affordable housing developers. So the strategy was similar to what's being discussed here. We have to bring in the affordable housing industry to come in and be partners and help the housing authority out. They bring with them money because they could do private borrowing. They have more freedom. They brought with them development expertise, and they brought with them management expertise, because that's specifically what it is that they're doing. So this was really the major overall regeneration strategy. But we were very fearful of privatizing public housing. We had so much of it because it was sort of part of a culture in the UK of the government doing it, really since the 50s with rationing, that the government is the one in control. So it was intimidating to bring in the private sector in this mission because it was all public land, public buildings. So to counteract this new partnership, we needed to add some balance. And that was about elevating the voice of residents to actually take part in the decision-making about how to get to decent homes. So everyone was working together. And this was how the balance would be struck. So the tenants are the public good. Then they're speaking for the public good and trying to maintain any of the fears or difficulties of private sector getting involved in public housing to mitigate that. But also the idea, and this was sort of part of a political idea in the UK of the service user knowing best. The idea that the residents actually know what is needed more than anyone else for their housing and for their neighborhoods. And so the private sector and housing authorities should utilize that. So there was a menu of options set up for every housing authority to try and get to decent homes. And this is just some of them. You have some of these in your program. Transfer of a whole set of developments, sometimes an entire housing authority transferred to an affordable housing provider. And because that was concluded that was the only way that they could get to decent homes. Standard. Sometimes there was more public-private partnerships. So the housing authority would partner with a private developer in order to try and get there. Sometimes it wasn't redevelopment needed, it was just improved management. So hundreds of thousands of units got transferred from housing authority management to what was called an arm's length management organization. So a separate management organizations for a set of developments set up. And then the housing authority could be the strategic operator of that management company, set metrics for it, say where it's failing, say what it's not going well. Some of this went even further, and actually it was groups of tenants that set up their own management organizations and then would have a contract with the public housing authority to be running certain parts of the management. So there was a whole array of different options set up, again with this goal of how are you going to get to the decent homes. This was a project I worked on in London. We ended up doing it as transfer to an affordable housing provider. That was the decision made by the housing authority in direct partnership with the residents. The residents wanted full transfer for it not to be even owned by the housing authority anymore, and that's what the housing authority wanted, and that they were too burdened. So we worked with the residents to say exactly what all the new development would be. It was full demolition, full redevelopment, and this is the same site now, mixed income, mix of affordable and market. This is one of the units. So what we're going to hear from today, from these three amazing panelists, is a bit more of the story about how residents were really involved. This is not resident consultation. This is beyond consultation. So just an example of transfer, if the whole land and buildings transferred from housing authority to an affordable housing provider. So this is a direct example from like the one that I worked on. The residents were selected the best regeneration option for them in direct partnership with the local authority, with the housing authority. So we'll hear some of the mechanisms for doing that, but certainly we'll hear from Jeff Bell, who is a public housing resident. Sometimes that's a direct memorandum of understanding or a partnership agreement between the residents and the housing authority that this is what their task is. And they have the right to veto the options. So transfer was selected. The selection of the affordable housing provider itself, affordable housing providers bidding to take over, and the residents pick in partnership with the housing authority. Then decision making, we'll hear from Jeff a lot more about what form this takes. Decision making on the redevelopment, rehab, and the ongoing management plans for the development. And then there was a final vote on the final transfer. So that is all the development plans, all the ongoing management, all the ongoing community development, the lease arrangements, everything was set. And then all the tenants on the development had to vote, and you needed a majority to say yes. So the affordable housing providers, were really incentivized to be doing what it is that the residents wanted. And just another example of just the management stuff, more on the tenant management side. Obviously, this is pretty direct resident involvement on the management side. But you could also have arm's length management organizations, just where you choose to have 3 residents on the board or 5 residents on the board, like playing with those ratios of power to make sure that there's real traction for the resident voice. I'm just going to end and pass over to our guests. But from 2000 to 2015, non-decent public housing units went from 43% to we're around 16% public housing, non-decent. Thank you.